My name is Tracy Metz. I'm the host of the live talk show Stadsleven, City Life, about life in cities in general and Amsterdam in particular. Over half the world's population lives in cities now, so urban issues are urgent and relevant for all of us. On the website of Stadsleven, www.stadslevenamsterdam.nl, we have a series of video interviews with urban thinkers, including Richard Sennett, Yevgeny Morozov, and Enrique Peñalosa, the former mayor of Bogota in Colombia. Today I'm speaking with Saskia Sassen, sociologist and economist, about her new book called Expulsion, about how the global inequality is increasing at the same time as the amount of global cash is increasing. I want to congratulate you on the translation of your book Expulsion into Dutch. Here it is, if you haven't seen it yet.
Yes.
It's called Uitstoting, brutaliteit en complexiteit in de wereldeconomie. Also with contributions by two Belgian scholars, Dirk Holemans and Stijn Oosterlings. You call it expulsion because this is the theme in the book, that expulsion is the result of increasing inequality in a world run by global capitalism. Is this a new thing?
It definitely is not a new thing. The argument that I try to make is that inequality is not enough. It's there, it's real, it's getting worse. It's always been there, but it's getting worse in this particular period. But my argument is rather that inequality is not enough to capture the particularities of this period. Because inequality has always been there. Inequality is a distribution that keeps changing. So I think that the language of inequality is very important. The studies of inequality are very important. I myself have contributed to that. But I want to understand what is different today. At what point does the question of inequality either become so extreme that we can't quite call it inequality? A black man in Haarlem who is 33 years old and has never had a job, to call him unemployed does not capture what is really going on. Similarly, all the dead land and dead water is not captured by the term inequality. And it is very much a part of our current period, that we're just killing land and water bodies. So that is a bit the idea for me.
Is the period characterized by expulsion? Did that start after the Second World War? Did it start during the period of growth in the spectacular wealth of the 80s? Is this something post-crisis?
This is something that, in my reading, takes off in the Western countries, especially the United States, probably one of the first in its brutal imposition of this new regime that is often referred to as neoliberalism. Neoliberalism captures only part of that story, but it has to do with deregulation of the economy, privatization of the economy. That in turn weakens governments. It has to do with a refusal to take the environmental tragedy or crisis seriously in too many parts of the world. It has to do with the demand for new types of minerals that come out of our technological moment, that have produced a type of mining that absolutely destroys the bodies of the workers who do this type of mining. So there is a specificity to the current period that is, of course, a partial element of this current period. It is added to longer-term trends that have long been there. The destruction of the environment is an old story. Inequality is an old story. So I was sort of particularly keen on capturing this moment. There are things that only begin to become visible or begin to be deployed in the 1980s. And so that is a bit the argument here. So it's a partial account. It doesn't try, and yes, inequality has long been there, absolutely.
Does expulsion affect only the poor, or now also even the middle class, even in wealthy countries like the US and the Netherlands?
Yes, I mean, we're beginning to see this. I am not an expert on the Netherlands, but I know that modest middle classes are getting, to put it kindly, more modest, if not poorish, or their children are unemployed, elderly people who are retired, their pensions are being reduced. So, even in a country like the Netherlands, and those are the good countries in the world, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, compared to, but you see it in brutal ways, just continuing with Europe, in Greece and in Spain and in Italy, where you have thousands of small entrepreneurs who are not getting paid by their governments or who just commit suicide. These are horrible stories. The numbers are small. Really, the zone that I look at is a minority of our populations. And that is those who are subject to expulsions, that is to say, are a minority. But it's a growing minority. And it is creeping into areas, into domains where before we did not see such extreme crises, such extreme despair. I think one of the reasons it's so difficult to capture what I'm trying to capture is that when you look at any of our cities, they are the spaces of luxury, well-built renovations, great architecture are expanding. And this is also the story of the last 20 to 30 years, that our cities become richer, more beautiful, more perfect, and that gives the impression of prosperity, we're all doing better. I was beginning to talk about some of these issues, back in the early 1990s, when I spoke about growing inequality is coming, and people did not accept it. They did not accept it because I was digging in the shadows, if you want, of that zone, that expanding zone of prosperity. I've always been interested in what happens at the edges of a system, not at the heart. So at the center, a lot of our European countries, they're doing fine compared to just about the rest of the world. The question is what happens at the edges? And that is sort of what I think then as these systemic edges, where if you cross that edge, you're really out. You're not counted, you're invisible, etc., etc. And I do the same for part of the environmental issue as it plays out in land and with water.
One of your...
And I'm still smiling.
But for how long? You said that expulsion is a threat to government. Could this get to the point where the inequality in society is truly a threat to the stability of government?
I think our governments in the Western world, reasonable governments, so to say. The United States is not a reasonable government, but I would say most European countries have more or less have reasonable governments. I think all of these Western-style governments are a bit in crises, not open crises, but there is a kind of sense that they're not quite working the way they should be working. So even if when they work well, it's a very partial benefit to a country. It could be done better. But I think that liberal democracy, as we have known it in the West, is in decay. So decay means a very gradual loss of purpose, loss of effectiveness. I think we're a bit there. And I would say even the so-called crisis, the migrant crisis, is an indication of how Europe, and I think of Europe as the best run part of the world that we have. I think of Europe, anyhow, in very positive terms, that Europe lost the plot. If you trace the last year, at the end of 2014, they closed the Mare Nostrum program, which was just the wrong time to close it, as the migrations, etc. At every step, they were taken by surprise by this emergent new history. And we're dealing with hundreds of thousands, or now, I guess, over 2 million probably. Well, there are 100 million alone in Syria who are displaced. So there is a sense of that our current states have a kind of incapacity to deal with the new types of crises that they confront.
And at the same time, we see this global capitalism where money seems to be in no shortage at all, that hangs like a soap bubble around our societies, and where investment is taking off like there's no tomorrow. One of the things you mentioned in Amsterdam, which I thought was really interesting, was the tremendous jump in foreign investment in Amsterdam, in offices and housing. You could also say that's a sign of a city's success.
Part of the issue is that the city had an urban land, because we're to some extent speaking about urban land. And the question is, how do you buy urban land? Well, you buy it via properties, right? So they're buying properties. Who knows what is next? You see, they may be buying the properties to tear them down, although I hope in the case of the 12 or 13 beautiful buildings that were bought in central Amsterdam by a Chinese investor, that they will not tear them down. But we see in New York, they'll buy, they tear down, and then they set up a very high tower. So it's clearly true that cities have become desirable. Everybody wants to buy into them, etc., etc. The issue is partly what you mentioned. There is an excess of cash. We're not just talking financial value as measured by derivatives, a very ambiguous, No, we're talking cash, money, actual money. There has been such an effective extraction of money from citizens and from governments via a highly intermediated and hence pretty difficult to track economic logic that for shorthand we call neoliberalism, but neoliberalism doesn't begin to capture the complexity, effectiveness, and sophistication of this economic circuit. That in fact now they have too much money at the top, and they are losing consumption capacity, buying capacity, etc., in the vast sectors of prosperous working classes and prosperous middle classes. So some economic sectors are beginning to feel the pinch. I think the high-level finance can still manage fine. What is next in terms of this urban property buying is a good question. And we may want to pursue that, at some point here.
I spoke to someone at the city of Amsterdam about your worry that the influx of foreign capital into the city was a negative thing. And he said, well, there are also positive consequences, because you see that foreign investors are willing to, say, if they're buying big blocks of social housing, they're willing to buy in places that for the Dutch are a bad neighborhood. He said foreign investors have much less cliche ideas of good and bad neighborhoods than we do here locally. So he said in a way they're much freer and have a different set of criteria for their investments. And maybe that's not a bad thing after all.
Well, I hope he's right. The evidence suggests that, yes, foreign investors and national investors, really, I think what is important here is that it's corporate buying of urban properties. Whether it's foreign or national, I in my opinion, not everybody agrees, is secondary. So here is the issue. A big foreign company, it happens to be a foreign company, it could be a national, has just bought a huge piece of land in Brooklyn called Atlantic Yards. This is in New York, not in Manhattan. Atlantic Yards is huge space, one of the biggest unbuilt or semi-built spaces of New York City. Right now it has poor artists, little manufacturing shops, poor housing, but it's vibrant. People love going there. It's real, it's urban. Now, the investor has spent a vast amount of money to buy this huge property. Everything that is on there now goes. And it's going to be replaced with 14 huge but beautiful luxury towers for apartments. You get the picture. Now, number one, a plain urbanist, an urban planner would say, great, more people, more density, because before it was everything very low rise, more density, etc., it upgrades the neighborhood, because that is a pretty run. It used to be an old manufacturing and sort of transport space. 14 towers, so many new consumers. Yes, of course that is true. But at the same time, I would argue that this mode of occupying urban space de-urbanizes the city. We love cities because there are all these mixes and this little bit of town, it's an adventure. Those 14 beautiful, perfect towers, one thing that they will not be is an adventure. And in that sense, it sort of de-urbanizes. Now, that is sort of just the practical side, of the city. There is also a social question that hangs in there. And who benefits from these acquisitions? It's not clear. And again, whether they are national or foreign, I think is secondary. They're corporate. That's the point. Ultimately, even a national corporation might be owned by who knows what mix of international capitalists. And the final point, which to me is the most important one, is that, and this is my particular definition of the city, not everybody would agree with this, but I think of a city, if I try to understand what is a city without falling into the notion, well, a city is a city, densely built up, whatever. I'd say the city is a place which, when you really try to get down to the bottom of it, is a place where those without power, historically, have been able to make a history, make a culture, make a kind of sub-economy. And that has added to the cosmopolitanism of cities, to all these diversities, and what is happening right now, these types of acquisitions, no matter that they add density, and one would say, oh, density is urban. Well, I'm not so sure, right? And they are problematic. If a city becomes more like a corporate office park, a fully controlled space, if the tissue of a real urban tissue has a lot of little streets, little square, little poor government office that is, however, an anchor for a lot of the residents, because that's my government office, a little this, a little that, something is lost. And we wind up with something that is more like an office park, only with a lot of apartments for residences. We will lose something. Finally, my big question is, why are they so keen now on buying what is ultimately a complex situation, which is buying urban land? That is not an easy thing. My project is called Who Owns the City? Which I think is a good question to ask. It's not clear at all. Who owns the city? And in principle, streets and parks are public spaces. If you replace a whole set of blocks with a mega project, who gives those corporations the right, or the local government the right, to accept that they eliminate all that public space? Who benefits? Is there a reason? There are too many tricky questions in this kind of buying. I do think also, on the positive end, that even if they transform many of our cities into corporate parks mostly, that the push towards having genuine urban space is not going to die. So we'll find out other ways of expanding, like Atlantic Yards was a way of expanding the city when so much of Manhattan was getting, so the artists went there. But, these are all big ifs.
One of the tendencies that you describe in this book, Expulsion, is how there's a new kind of global housing market only for the super rich. And I think we saw some frightening examples in London recently, for example, with the building One Hyde Park, where one of the apartments was paid for in cash by an Oli billionaire from Kazakhstan who paid over £100 million for it in cash. Is this just a little icing on the cake that we don't need to worry about, or does this mean more than just those few very expensive apartments? So this is something, as you mentioned, that Amsterdam is also worrying about as news filters down that some of the canal houses are being bought by Russians and Chinese.
Well, I think that what we're seeing at work in this is a new type of market. and it's referred to, in the business as the super prime market, super prime, right? And it establishes, basic minimum prices. It's a bit arbitrary. And in fact, the minimum prices that I show in that book are the official minimum prices. Yeah. But the actual prices now, you can't get anything in New York for 20 million, or 10 million. It's 80 million to 100 million. But, and in fact, that is a great research project that the Financial Times did, and I also helped in that. And it was just beginning to capture this emergent new market, but it also has properties that are cheaper than the 100 million that the Kazakhstan rich man or woman paid for. Now, here is my problem. It calls itself a market, but it's one of these matched markets. It's a coordinated market. So it only addresses, certain needs. To call it a market it's a kind of market, but it's a very special kind of market. Okay?
Calling it a market suggests that there's some form of regulation or self-regulation.
Exactly, and it's not clear. I mean, there is a respect of the law. Supposedly when salespeople are in that market, they are respecting the law. It's above water, it's clean, it's not a strange. But there was also an acquisition that happened in London that was by a recognized international criminal type. And that was something that slipped in between, of course, that is happening also. But the thing about this market is that it aspires to be a specialized market that is global and that operates within the law. So that is already something, I would say. The real issue is what you said at the start, which is there is such an amount of concentrated money at the top. It is looking desperately for ways to invest. And there isn't much left. The global financial system is not doing as well as it did. It's not as attractive as it used to be. So this notion of buying urban land, which in good cities, that will forever have value. There might be ups and downs, but it's at this time, I guess it looks safer than to put it in some kinds of the most speculative kinds of financial instruments. And the financial system is still making money, Let's not, but it is different, And the crisis has meant something to some of the investors. So, I was absolutely, because we know about the land grabs, right? Rural land buying, mining, and all of that. That became a very powerful investment also during the crisis. And in 2006, the figures show that for a period of 6 months in 2006, which the financial system at that point knew the crisis was coming, but it was not a publicly announced crisis as happened in 2008, right? Then the global crisis is announced, so to say. For a period of 6 months, the main buyers of land in sub-Saharan Africa were hedge funds, not because they wanted to be, farmers, because it was a good investment. So that is what put me on the track of what's happening with urban land. You see, because then I said, well, urban land is an even better investment. And then you begin to see also the escalation in this investment in cities. And as you said, Amsterdam, the rate of increase from 1 year to the next, it was one of the highest in the top 10 that I showed. It was like 234% increase from 1 year to the next.
In 1 year, amazing.
And that itself, who knows what, this is something that takes off in 2008. The data really start in 2008. And so escalate, what is next? You see, so some cities have already reached the top a bit. And you see new cities growing in terms of investment. If you look at the full list of the 100, some of the cities that are at the bottom in terms of total investment are the most rapidly growing. So this is a roving opportunity, if you want, or option for these investors. And as we know, many of the properties sit empty.
I was just going to ask, is this for, I have the impression that for many of the super rich who buy an apartment or a house, they have several to begin with, and they're not buying a house, they're buying an address, or they're making an investment with no emotional value or commitment.
Yeah, that is another issue that sort of feeds into this de-urbanizing of the city. We know that in Manhattan, there has been a lot of construction of these very slender high buildings. They call them pencil buildings, very chic and luxurious. And we have comments from some residents who will say, well, at night, I'm the only one in the elevator. And people who walk around, people like me who are trying to check out the situation, one or two lights on. Clearly for the developer who put down that building, this was not simply about making profit now. This is an investment that could be a fairly long-term investment. And at least you have a foothold on that property. And you expect that eventually demand will come, or something like that. But a lot of the buildings are standing empty, and a lot of apartments that were bought are actually barely used. In one of my pieces, maybe we can put it online, I show photographs taken by a brilliant and courageous photographer of The Guardian who went into these properties in parts of London, which are very grand. And they are, the neighbors, the rich British neighbors complain they would like more people, more city. They're not like Hollywood where they want it empty. No, not in London. And so the photos show in some of these properties, trees growing inside. So they're just sitting there. This is a particular property that we all know is owned by the Saudis. They have that foothold. If there is a revolution back in the homeland, hey, they have that mansion. It's a mansion. They have that mansion in London. Who knows what the reasoning is, right? But the thing is that it's a good idea. And some of these properties, of course, were bought in an earlier period. It was probably the need for an alternative palace, so to say, in case you were going to be thrown down. Now they are so entrenched, all these dictatorships, that I think they are less afraid than they were. That's an interesting point. The 60s and the 70s were very particular moments.
Thank you so much, Saskia Sassen, for this eloquent expose based on your new book, Expulsion, Uitstoting in the Dutch translation.
It's always a great pleasure, Tracy. It's wonderful to talk with you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Saskia. Bye-bye.